Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this morning's installment in the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. We are excited to have with us today, I'm sorry, I have a button on my computer. Okay, there. We're excited to have with us today Joel Rogers, who will be speaking with us about considerations for your nonprofit if you're working abroad. And he'll be specifically talking about concerns around anti-bribery and anti-corruption and why in the world of nonprofit would even need to be concerned about these. But before Joel starts talking about today's substance, I want to tell you a little bit about the mission of PBPA. If I can get my slide to move forward. So the mission of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is to provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits. We do this by connecting local nonprofits with attorneys from the leading organizations and law firms in Atlanta. Usually we have about 700 attorneys volunteer with us on an annual basis to serve in local organizations. If you're interested in becoming a client of PBPA, please go to our website. You'll be able to find a request for legal assistance form there. And generally speaking, our clients must meet certain criteria. They must be 501c3 nonprofit organizations located in or generally serving the metro Atlanta area. And their clients are low income or disadvantaged individuals. Our clients are also otherwise unable to afford legal services. Also on our website, you'll find a host of other resources, including articles, podcasts, webcasts, and information about upcoming events. Normally we have in-person workshops. We haven't had them for several months now, but we hope to be picking those up in the next several months. And now a quick disclaimer about PBPA and our services. The information you're going to get today from Joel is just general guidelines. It is not specific legal counsel. If you have questions about your nonprofit specific situation, please reach out to an attorney for more guidance. And today's presentation is copyrighted. And now, Joel, I'll hand the mic over to you and to talk about today's topic.
Well, thanks, Sarisha, and thanks to the whole Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta organization for having these programs generally on a monthly basis. I think they're great, and I think that it's a fantastic way to give folks information on a bunch of diverse topics. Today, we're going to be talking, as Sarisha said, about doing business internationally as a nonprofit, and with a particular eye on anti-bribery laws and their implications. And before we jump in to the main event, which is talking about the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the U.S. law, I thought I'd give you a little background about myself. I'm a lawyer at Home Depot. I've been at Home Depot for 15 years. I lead a team that supports the international operations of the company. So Home Depot is a North American retailer. So we have retail operations in Canada, Mexico, and the US. We used to have them in China, but we got out of China. And then we have sourcing operations. So we procure product. While the majority of our product actually comes from the United States, we also procure product from around the world. So we have folks in China, India, and elsewhere looking for suppliers and then working to make sure, we're responsibly sourcing our products, that sort of thing. So that's my job, is supporting all of that team. I really like my job. I love the company. Home Depot is a values-based company. So, two of our core values are doing the right thing, which means complying with laws, but also giving back to the communities where we operate. So at times of crisis, when Hurricane Ida hit. We're in communities trying to help with recovery efforts. We do partner closely with Kaboom and various veterans causes. And so we are not a nonprofit, as you would know, but we act like one in many respects, and that makes me feel great, happy to be working there. I'm here today, though, to talk about FCPA just in my own capacity, not on behalf of the company. So anything I say are my views and not the company's. Just give the usual disclaimer, although I don't think I'll say anything particularly controversial. What I was hoping to cover today is, give you some background on the FCPA, and then with a particular focus on how it impacts nonprofits, and then talk a little bit about compliance programs and some thoughts and considerations for nonprofits. So if we could turn to the next slide. What is the FCPA? It's a US law designed with two things in mind. One, it has anti-bribery or anti-prohibitions. So in simplest form, it's a law that prohibits US persons, and we'll talk about who it covers, but it's broad from essentially offering, giving, or paying anything of value to a foreign official to obtain or retain business or gain an advantage. So it's a very broad, and we'll talk about the breadth of that, but it's don't pay bribes if you had to really distill it down to its essence. And then the other part of the law is really, you have to keep accurate books and records. You have to have internal controls to guard against payment of bribes, to ensure that someone can look at your books and records and understand what's going on. And if you don't do that, that's a separate violation of the law. There's a little picture of a person being convicted. That's Al Capone. And the point there with Al Capone, he was a bootlegger, murderer, a renowned criminal. But what did he go to jail for? Tax evasion. So, that's what the books and records provision is designed to get at, is if the government is having difficulty proving perhaps that you're actually engaged in bribery, sometimes it's easier for them to prove that you have violated the books and records provisions. So that's a little bit more. We'll talk more about that in a second, those two provisions. A little more background about the FCPA. It was established in 1977, actually in the wake of the Watergate scandal. And as the US government, Congress in particular, investigated into what happened surrounding Watergate, one of their key findings was a lot of US companies had effectively slush funds, accounts that were designed and earmarked for either political activity or actually internationally. They were using money to pay bribes, to try to get contracts, to try to get advantages or permits. And our government said, took a stand and said, hey, we're trying to develop democracies. We're trying to develop a global landscape free from corruption, because corruption doesn't help populations. It doesn't benefit society. And so we are going to have a law that has an extraterritorial application that essentially says US companies, US persons, and anybody operating on their behalf, you can't bribe. And this was a pretty revolutionary thing when it happened. So it went on the books and sat there candidly for quite some time, for decades, without much enforcement until kind of the 90s, the late 90s, in a case that was actually prosecuted out of the Atlanta District Attorney's Office involving Lockheed Martin. The US government stepped up, and when I say the US government, the Justice Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission started enforcing this. And what we've seen from that point going forward to date, it has ratcheted up enforcement dramatically, with many cases in the pipeline. A quarter doesn't go by, probably a month doesn't go by without reading in the papers an actual settlement involving companies. And these penalties can be massive. That we'll talk about that a little more in a second. So I wanted to switch to sort of who's covered by this law. As I said, it's focused on US persons, but it's actually quite broad. This is one of these laws that some of our trading partners and other countries bristle at, because it's the US pushing the bounds and saying, hey, if you're a US company or citizen, you're governed by this law. But it also covers, in many cases, foreign subsidiaries of US companies. It covers foreign nationals acting on behalf of US companies. And so it's got a really broad kind of jurisdiction. And one key takeaway for this audience is it covers nonprofits. There is nothing in the law that excludes a nonprofit, even if you're not out there trying to, enhance revenue for shareholders, and instead you're trying to be beneficial to society. You're still governed by these laws, and so that's important to note. So we're going to switch back now and talk a little bit more on the next slide about anti-bribery prohibitions in the FCPA. And this provision, this slide is designed to reflect kind of the breadth of what the scope covers, because I think we all on the phone here or in the meeting would recognize that paying a suitcase full of cash to a government official to try to get a permit, to try to get a contract, to secure some rights or privileges, that is unseemly. Just ethically, the Jimmy Cricket on your shoulder would tell you that's not going to be legal. But the law really is much broader than that. It covers offers, promises of payment of money. So you don't even have to pay it. If you offer it, if you promise it in exchange for some sort of improper benefit, that's enough to violate the law. And it's not just money that we're talking about. It's also, so it's not just suitcases full of cash. It can be gift cards. It can be anything of value. One on the slide here, there's a little news article about JP Morgan. Just to give an example there, JP Morgan was trying to operate in various countries in Asia. They were trying to get government contracts to represent the government as an institutional banker. And one of the things they did was they offered internships to the sons and daughters of government officials. And the US government prosecuted them and said, hey, that's something of value to those government officials. And if you are offering those to those government sons and daughters in the anticipation that will bring you, in exchange for getting business, that sort of quid pro quo, that's something of value, and that violates the law. Another area where cases come up would be charitable donations. If you give a donation to a charity that's affiliated with a government official, and that's something of value that government official gets a benefit from, that can be a violation. So it's important to think about how broad that is. It also can cover gifts and entertainment, can cover travel, and so very, very broad indeed. The law also covers not only those types of things given directly, it also covers those indirectly. So, if you have an agent or third party operating on behalf of your nonprofit and they're in country doing something, if they give a bribe, if they give a gift for an improper purpose, that can actually cause a violation by you if your company either knew about it or should have known about it. So the takeaway here is you can't put your head in the sand. And the other takeaway is most companies, if you're going to be relying on an agent to act on your behalf in front of foreign officials, it's really critical from a compliance perspective to communicate with that third party, make sure they understand your expectations, make it crystal clear to them that you don't want them paying bribes. Ideally, you get a certification from them, representing that they understand your expectations. Ideally, you also, if sign a contract, if you're signing a services agreement with them, you make sure the contract has FCPA safeguards so that it says, hey, you represent, you will comply with the all applicable anti-bribery laws, and allows you to terminate with them if they don't do that. And then another item of note is you can't offer to pay money or anything of value directly or indirectly to a foreign official, a government official. That is broadly construed too, to cover, the family members of a government official, to cover state-owned enterprises. So in a lot of countries, the utility company, for instance, may be state-owned, or a hospital may be state-owned. And, companies have gotten into trouble, people have gotten into trouble if they pay a bribe to a state-owned entity for some, contract, or they are trying to sell product to a state-owned hospital. And so they give benefits to a doctor who's deciding what prescriptions to write or what medical devices to buy. Those are all instances where those are improper payments to a government official and would be covered by this law. And it's also really broadly interpreted as to what, for an improper purpose means. So, I've definitely heard from nonprofits that say, hey, look, we're not in business. We're not trying to get some advantage. We're actually trying to do benefit to society. How could we ever violate this law? And we'll talk in a little bit. Actually, the government has investigated various nonprofits. It's prosecuted employees of nonprofits. And so, you're not immune from this law just because you're a nonprofit. So, yes.
I have a quick question going back to the last slide and about anything of value.
Yes.
And the examples you include here, would you include in there something of value that is part of the charitable mission of the organization? For example, if an organization tries to teach about sustainable agrarian principles or something in abroad, and they're trying to teach government officials about those practices, and that educational resource is of value, and if you're providing that service to government officials or something, would that be considered under this?
That's an excellent question, Sarisha. I appreciate you asking it while we're talking through the things. I also apologize for not saying at the outset, if folks have questions as we go along, we welcome them. Feel free to put them in the chat box. Sarisha, I'm trying to monitor it, but I think Sarisha will do a better job monitoring it than me. So feel free to ask questions. But that's a great question, and a timely one, because I'm about to turn to some of the exceptions to the provisions. But I will tell you that one right there is an easy one to answer, still looking at this slide, because you are right, that would constitute something of value. Training to government officials is certainly something of value, but for the law to be violated, you have to hit each of these elements. And when you go down to that bottom element of to obtain or retain business or an improper advantage, I did note it's very broadly interpreted, but it would not be so broadly interpreted in this case to cover that type of training, because typically if I was, that is training that the nonprofit would be giving to further its mission, but it's not to retain business in the sense of getting some sort of improper advantage or other business. So that is very much a situation where you could do it. And I will talk about two more situations where value is given in the next couple of slides related to nonprofits. So I'm glad you started that dialogue because we have a couple more examples too. So maybe turning to the next slide, this is the law, like I said, is very broad. It does expressly contain several exceptions or affirmative defenses. So first we'll talk about the key exception in the FCPA. It is for what are called facilitating payments. So again, the law was written in the 1970s. And at that time, there was a bit of pushback as it was being debated because a lot of companies said, look, we may not be able to do business at all in some countries because, you know, for the customs service to actually clear your product, even if you've done everything correctly, we have to give, you know, a modest $5 amount or, you know, some modest fee just to facilitate that process and to get routine government action done or to get into a country, we may have to pay a small amount. And so what the law did was it carved out and said, all right, something like a facilitating payment or a grease payment, we are going to say does not violate the FCPA. So it's a pretty narrow exception. It says it's got to be to expedite or secure, quote, routine government action, things like securing basic services. So like I said, a state-owned entity like the telephone company, if it's state-owned, they come in and say, hey, you want your phone hooked up. I see all your paperwork is in order. You need to pay us something. The law says, you know, for those types of things, you can pay it if it is non-discretionary. So, you know, there's no legal basis for them to reject it. And it's modest and a small payment. And then remember the books and records part of the law, it has to be accurately reported in your books. So that is on the law. And I will tell you that some, you know, especially if you're a small nonprofit and you're trying to get a small shipment into a country and you're confronted with this, you have that at your disposal to consider, you know, availing yourself to. I will tell you, most people, and even it is an exception available, and sometimes you may have no choice but to rely on it. But there is, you know, that payment is probably illegal under local law, and it is also, you know, what I will tell you is most companies and most other countries no longer have a facilitating payment exception. And so most companies have said, if we're going to work with our third parties, if we're going to work with our team, we're not going to give a blanket allowance to make small payments because it sends a bad message to your employees and your agents. It also is illegal under the local law wherever you're going. And candidly, it's not in keeping with, you know, your mission of doing right for society. If you're paying money that funnels money away from your objectives, you want to try to steer against that. So this one's tricky, though, I will be the first to admit. If you're a Home Depot or a big multinational and you can work with massive companies, and if you're getting at the customs border, someone saying, hey, you need to pay us a bribe, you have the ability to go above that person and go to the government or go through, you know, a lot of our shipping companies belong to trade associations that have a voice with the customs authorities. I will tell you, the world's changed since the 70s. It is not the norm to have to pay that. Most places, you should be, if you have to pay it, you know you have this exception, but I would say you should be trying to, you know, go to the US Embassy and say, hey, I have this issue. Is there a way I can try to resolve this? You know, go to try to reach out and align with others because there's a lot of work underway to root out the kind of real low level corruption. But I will tell you there is this exception. I will tell you that that's still not a big focus of enforcement. So, that's a tricky area. I wanted to make sure we addressed that because it is one that's hard to grapple with, but, you should be trying to steer away from it and ideally not have facilitating payments occurring on your behalf. So that's all I'll say on that one. Affirmative defenses, there are two key ones. So what an affirmative defense is in the law, it's a situation where they say, hey, this could actually constitute a violation of the law, but you are allowed to do it if you meet the following criteria. One is if it's allowed under local law, that has to be the written laws and regulations of the local country. And it is, I will tell you, extremely hard to meet. But if you're in a situation where, you're trying to get a contract and the local law requires you to hire a local agent and there are only 4 authorized local agents and you have concern about all 4 of them, it may be that you can hire one of them because you're required to under the local law. But still, that's an area where you have to be very careful and is very, very limited. The other one is promotional expenditures. So if you're doing something that's bona fide and reasonable, it's to promote and demonstrate what you do as a company or a contract. That's not for an improper purpose. That is something that the government recognizes. So there are a couple ways this comes up. One, if you meet a government official over a meal and it's not a lavish knockout, crazy thing, it's a reasonable meal. You're conducting business with them. You're explaining who you are, what your business relates to, and you're very transparent about it. That can be acceptable because it's not for an improper purpose. That's one way where this provision comes into play. Another one, candidly, Sarisha, on the one you were describing, if I'm going in and training, I'm describing, providing training, that could potentially fall under this too. So I don't think it even meets all of the criteria, but even if it did, you could also argue it was a fit under this. And another area, if you met with a government official, like let's say, like a company like a Home Depot is trying to source product in a country and you're meeting with the Ministry of Commerce to try to identify potential sourcing partners, and you give an example of a product that you sell in your store that has the Home Depot logo or whatever the company is logo, it's a token item to demonstrate your product, that would also not violate. So those are examples, and wanted to make sure we covered those. We also wanted to, and actually, if you can flip the slide forward, I'm sorry, because we've been talking about the next slide, the affirmative defenses slide. Nope, the one behind this. Thank you. So then the last thing I'll mention here is, while not an affirmative defense, extortion is not bribery. So this is a key point to make. And it comes up often because another thing that nonprofits and many companies run across is situations where you're in a country, you are stopped at a roadside with a police, person stopping you, make you get out of your car. They say, let's see your passport, let's see your information. And they say, all right, well, we're not sure you're legally in the country. We're going to have to take you in, just you, not your driver, unless you give us, pay me personally in cash a fee or a fine. They're clearly shaking you down. But if your health and safety is at risk, that is not for an improper purpose. That's to protect yourself from being violated. And so that We tell our teams internally, you can pay that, but you should report it to your employer. Make sure if you're going to get reimbursed for that it's transparently disclosed in your books and records, so that there are no issues. Next slide. We've been talking about the law, what the anti-bribery provisions cover. I think it's important also to note that the anti-bribery law, FCPA, doesn't necessarily make political donations illegal. Like I said, if they're for a proper purpose, if they're transparent, they can be appropriate. But here's where we get into the differences that nonprofits have to address. If you're a 501c3, which I suspect most of you are, you cannot accept or give political donations. So you as a nonprofit cannot give political donations. So it's important just to note briefly that that is something that could potentially happen with other companies, but not with a nonprofit. So going forward to the next slide, the other part of the law is the accounting requirements. I'm just going to mention briefly that requires you keep good, accurate books and records. For nonprofits, I think the big takeaway is, this is just good governance. You should always be making sure you understand what your expenses are, who's getting the recipient of those expenses, how they should be properly classified. If you have any government official related or government related expenses, you ought to be very transparent. And that goes for your third parties too. Make sure you scrutinize their invoices, because where a lot of companies get into trouble is they won't pay a bribe, but a third party will on their behalf. And then the third party will want to get it reimbursed, but they won't necessarily want to tell you they paid a bribe. So they'll try to couch it in vague or mysterious language like miscellaneous handling fee. Don't just pay those if a third party gives you those. Make sure you look in deeply, because that's how companies get into trouble. So on the next slide, we've talked about the US law. This just notes that most other countries around the world now have their own laws. And since the 1970s, there have been multilateral conventions. China, UK, Brazil, all have their own laws. They've been on the books for a while. Like the US, took them a while to start enforcing, but they are now starting to enforce. So this is not just a US issue. You have to also be mindful of the laws where you're operating. Next slide. And you have to be mindful because there are potential penalties, criminal liability for individuals. You can go to jail if you are engaged in bribe-related activity. Companies are paying hundreds of millions of dollars of fines. In the retail space, the example I cite here is Walmart. Walmart ended up paying $283 million in FCPA-related fines. They actually spent over $1 billion in remediating, in compliance, in investigatory costs, in shareholder-related things. And so these can be massive cases for companies, and it really behooves you to take it seriously. The next slide focuses on FCPA issues for nonprofits. So I talked about the penalties that are on the books. Let's talk realistically for nonprofits. There haven't been any nonprofit organizations that have been prosecuted publicly, but some have been investigated, and individuals have been prosecuted. So there are a number of cases I could highlight, but I won't go into the details of World Bank related and other not NGO related operators where parties within those organizations crossed the line and were prosecuted. There was a situation where a large nonprofit that was giving humanitarian relief and assistance overseas was contacted by the Justice Department. They had to, they went through a thorough internal investigation. They were able to avoid prosecution, but not without a lot of headaches. And there are other ways you can get sanctioned, like if you're a USAID contractor, if you're a government agency contractor, there are cases where, you know, companies like, or nonprofits like the Academy for Educational Development have been sanctioned for bribery related activity, and they've gone out of business. So the takeaway is it's, you know, something you should take seriously and try to avoid. So the next slide, how do you take it seriously and try to avoid? Well, in general terms, this is sort of what the US government, the Justice Department, and the SEC highlight as hallmarks of an effective compliance program. You know, you start with tone at the top, commitment by senior management. You make sure you have compliance policies. You assess your risks, and then you train to make sure your folks understand what the risks are. And with third parties, you make sure you're communicating and vetting those third parties. One thing I haven't really mentioned, you know, some people get into trouble because they actually hire a government official to be their agent in country, or hire the wife or husband of a government official when they're trying to get a permit or trying to engage and get something from a government agency. You know, if you don't vet your third parties to make sure they're not government officials or related to government officials, you can end up with a nasty surprise, and the government's going to say, our government is going to say, hey, you should have known that relationship. So you need to make sure you're vetting your third parties, and then just, you know, investigating problems and kind of continuously trying to enhance your program is what the government suggests. The final slide I have is sort of, okay, taking that, if I'm a nonprofit, what should I really be focused on and what should I be considering? What I would say is, at a minimum, if you're working abroad, you ought to be attuned to the expectations that you're not going to bribe government officials, and third parties are not going to bribe government officials on your behalf. And you ought to make sure your team is attuned and your third parties are attuned, and saying, hey, we are trying to do a very you know, laudable mission, and this would run counter to our mission. So we are not going to bribe government officials, and we're going to work to ensure that doesn't happen. And one way to work is to make sure you have a policy that addresses this. Here's a plug for Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. The organization can help you if you don't have a policy, to put in place one that's not, you know, thousands of pages long, but is clear and straightforward, and it sort of helps you think through what you want to do. And then you should make sure your management, your board, your staff, everybody who's relevant, who may interact with folks, understands that policy. And then again, with third parties, making sure you're being vigilant. If you have more resources and it's a bigger issue for you, maybe you do annual risk assessments every year. I think that's a best practice. I think, you know, that's something to consider. Also, you know, doing a standalone audit to make sure you're not bribing government officials wouldn't make sense. Or if you're doing any kind of audit work, adding that as a module or a component might make sense too. So those are thoughts on how you can take, you know, these provisions and live them, because, you know, this is a legal requirement, but more than that, I think it's doing the right thing. It's an ethical, moral imperative, and as folks are trying to better the world, society overseas, this is one way I think you can enhance your mission by doing so. Sarisha, with that, those were my kind of prepared remarks, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Joel. And one thing I also wanted to mention, you know, we were talking about in our previous conversations, or in addition to concerns about having criminal charges brought against you, or just bad negative publicity, funders would not, you know, look favorably upon this as well. So that's another very relevant concern for
It's
nonprofits working abroad.
it's a great point, and it's particularly, you need to keep in mind, because there's reputational risk involved here for you as a nonprofit, but there's also reputational risk for your key donors. So absolutely, that the last thing you want to do is have somebody really proud to support you, trumpeting that, and then have their good name besmirched by improper activity.
One question I want to get one item I wanted to get clarification on. You mentioned that not only are organizations subject to FCPA, but individuals can be too. So does that mean an employee of a nonprofit could have charges brought against them, or they could be investigated under this?
It absolutely does. And so, for instance, there was a case a few years ago now, but a guy named Richard Pitchford, he was the vice president and country manager in Turkmenistan of the Central Asia American Enterprise Fund. And he was criminally charged and pleaded guilty to FCPA violations because he made improper payments to a UK foreign official that was responsible for promoting business for British companies in the Central Asian region. And so, so what I'll say, the takeaways are, yes, if you're sitting here in the US and you, approve, orchestrate a bribe, you can get into trouble. If you're local person for a subsidiary or an arm of your nonprofit, even if they're not a US person, they can be prosecuted, they can be investigated. And what we've seen more in the for-profit company area than the not-for-profit, but he or she will travel to the US for a business meeting, and the FBI will have them on a wanted list, and they'll get picked up as soon as they land in New York, LA, LaGuardia, or, wherever LA, LaGuardia, wherever they come, and they'll be carted off for processing, for a violation. So yes, absolutely, individuals can be caught in the crosshairs.
And we have a question from Todd about your recommendation for nonprofits to conduct audits. Do you happen to have recommendations on how a nonprofit should go about doing this, or how to find an entity to conduct such an audit?
Yeah, so I will tell you, it depends upon your budget, but certainly if you have money for all of the big four accounting firms, and all of the accounting firms do provide FCPA compliance and audit support. So we use one, for instance, as a company to help us with our auditing in China and Mexico and elsewhere. So, what I would say is probably the easiest item is if you already have an accounting firm, reach out to them, ask them. If there are organizations, maybe even through Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, I know there are accounting firms that do pro bono work. So you may be able to connect with someone who's willing to help a nonprofit. I know of a couple of folks who have done that in the past, kind of through Pro Bono Partnership. So it sort of depends upon, if you already have an existing relationship with an accounting firm, I'd start with them. But I also, if you want to connect with me, I can plug you in with some of the organizations we've used. But I also would recommend talking with Pro Bono Partnership offline as well.
Yeah, definitely. And how often should those FCPA audits be done?
So here's where you get into, I'll use my favorite lawyer answer. It depends, it depends upon your risk profile, how big an operation you are in certain, are you operating in, if you're a nonprofit that only operates in Canada, for instance, Canada is relatively non-corrupt. They're viewed on the corruption perception index as less corrupt than the US. Maybe you don't have to do too much in the way of audit work. But if you're in Turkmenistan, or if you're in Africa, where in a country that's highly known, has a highly known corruption level, and you're doing a lot of significant activity, you may want to do it every year. You may want to do it on an annual basis. But what I think, so it's got to be risk-based, and it's got to be proportionate to your resources. And that's why I was giving sort of a menu of options. Maybe you add it to an audit you're already doing, or maybe you do a full-fledged audit. It really depends upon your facts and circumstances.
Okay, well, Joel, that looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share this information and your expertise with us. And to nonprofits who are joining us and watching this, thank you guys so much for tuning in and for all the great work you continue to do in the community. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you very much.